Okay, my name is Walt Barbin,
You gotta look at me.
W-A-L-T, last name B-A-R-B-I-N.
Okay. So just a quick short. So, what's your first memory of drag racing?
My first actual memory of getting involved in the sport, I wanted to be a baseball player when I was about 13 or 14. And some older guys at the time that were 16, 17, 18 were buying these old Ford coupes and shooting a coat of primer on them and pulling the flathead engines out over a set of garage doors with a 4x4 and a chain hoist. And I think that was the beginning of getting hooked. The next step was I started building this 36 Ford convertible coupe, and I chopped it and put an Olds engine in it and so forth, Cadillac transmission and so forth. So I think it was 1954 or 55, there was a drag strip open in Allentown, Pennsylvania by a little group called the Lehigh Valley Timing Association. It was an abandoned airstrip. So I went to the opening day, which was, I think, in April of 54 or 5. I think it was 54. And it was an abandoned airstrip. So there wasn't really much there. There was a couple military buildings where they sold old military parts and so forth and so forth, like an Army surplus. And in order to, the spectators, there was no stands. They just stood along the track. And the spectators would donate in the hat a quarter or 50 cents so these guys could buy a little equipment and so forth. And they had the starter had a flag that he went up and down with. The finish line, there were two guys, one at each end, that would wave the flag and say who won or who lost the race. Well, at that race, I had this 36 Ford. I think I lost second or third round. I ran a class called B gas. At the time, all those coupes and so forth, horsepower to weight or cubic inch to weight and so forth, was determined. And there was A gas, which was with a supercharger, B gas, C, D. I don't even think there was an E gas at that time. So I ran B gas with this convertible coupe. Well, when the top cars came up, there was this real crude-looking, looked like old Model A frame rails with crude tires and so forth. And it had a flathead Ford in it, and it was a rear engine. And it burned nitro. And the car went down the track, and I smelled the nitro, and I was hooked. From that point on, when I got that smell, that was it for me. And so anyway, as time went on, I worked in a machine shop and so forth, and actually some of the innovations began with this 36 Ford. When I put the engine in and the fan and so forth and so on, I could not get the radiator in and the grill because the fan extended out too far. So what I did, I took the water pump, put it in a hydraulic press, pressed the seat where the fan goes on back. It was like 3/4 of an inch, took the crank pulley off, turned that down, moved that back, the radiator fit, and that was sort of the start of the beginning. In order to fit this Cadillac transmission, I took a Ford housing, a transmission housing, cut the front of it off, welded the plate, had a release bearing mounted with a fork, etc., etc. That worked well. So that was pretty much the beginning of it all. From that point, the next key point was in about 1958, 57, it might have even been 56, right in there, in that time frame. We started running these 471 GMC blowers. And Craig R., which I'm sure you're familiar with, that manufactures wheels and so forth, at that time made a kit, a drive kit for the blower, which the pulleys were 3 fan belts. Well, the problem we started running into, when you would get the engine over like 8,000, 8,200, 8,300, it would sling the belts off. So I called Craig, he says, oh, I can tell you the reason why. because it's not you're not getting a match set. You know, go to Gates, use this number, etc., and it'll be fine. Okay, so we go and we buy the match set, which was like triple the money. And at that time, you know, a $100 bill was a lot of money. So, put the match belts on, same problems. They were slinging the belts and so forth. And there was also a guy that built a lot of old engines and did blower work and so forth in a small town called Pendle, PA. His name was Jack Culp, genius. He was like an Austin Coyle type. Very bright guy. Well, he had a 40 Olds with an Olds in it that was blown. And we used to hang at his shop on the weekends and so forth. So, I was running a Curry lathe at the time in a small machine shop called CN Wood. And they made instruments and so forth. So, this Curry lathe was actually made in England. The lathes that we had in the shop previously to the small lathe were South Bend. And the South Bend lathes had a, where you would change the speed, they had these different circumference of these steel pulleys, and it was driven by a leather belt. I don't know if you remember those or not. So what you would do, you would open the little box door, lift the spring up in the handle, move the belt over and change the speed, and away you'd go. So, I'm running this Curry lathe, brand new lathe we had. And I'm opening the door and doing my routine during the day, making parts and so forth. And all of a sudden, I lift the door at one point in time, and I looked down and I said to myself, I wonder if that would work. It was a Gilmer timing belt that was made, Goodyear made the belts at the time. And the pulleys were cast iron. No slippage. And I started to wonder if that would work. So I got a little pumped up, and Goodyear at the time had a plant in Philly over near the Delaware River, big plant. I went over and talked to an engineer because they made the belts, the timing belts, Goodyear at that time. And I told him, you know, about the supercharger, the engine, and he's got this calculator out and so forth, as these engineers would do. And he starts telling me that it'll draw too much horsepower, it's going to shear the teeth off the belt, not going to work. Well, I drove home. I was so discouraged because I was so pumped up about it. And I started thinking on the way home, I said to myself, you know, if you make the pulleys and they don't work, you're going to be right back where you were, and you throw them away. So I said, I'm going to try it. So I made the pulleys. I used billet aluminum stock, turned them down on the lathe, drilled the holes for the crank pulleys, et cetera, et cetera. At that time, the top pulley on the Krager drive, or the drive on the Krager drive up top, had a long nose and a taper and a little key. So I made the pulleys up, and there was a certain dimension that you had to use that was given to me by the people that did the hobbing of the teeth. There was a small company that did lots of that in Philly. They were next to that Penn fishing reel company. It was called Stranahan Gear. Took the pulleys over there, and they hobbed the teeth on them. I think they were 1/2 pitch at the time. In fact, I didn't know any better. The idler pulley, I also had teeth done on them because I didn't know that using a flat pulley would work. I figured everything had to have teeth on it. $6 each to get them made, the machine work done. Amazing when you look at what's being spent today. So I took the pulleys. I went up to Jack Culp's shop, and he took the fan belt pulleys off, the Krager fan belt pulleys, put these pulleys on, started the engine up, and it's sitting there idling, and we're all standing back, ready to see things started to fly. So anyway, it idled for a while, and then he just gave it a little few RPMs, and next thing, the belt's still on. Well, we used to race about a mile from there on this Highway 1. There was a long stretch. So he took it up on Highway 1 and put the leg to it, and it was just fine. And that was the story of the getting the timing belts. Well, the thing was, at the time, I made them for friends. I made them for some racers locally. Market at that time, minuscule. And I never mentally was into selling high volume and marketing parts. I was into problem solving in my head and innovations and so forth. So, you know, I had some regrets later, but that's fine. But that's where my head was. It wasn't selling thousands of pieces all over here and there. So, okay. Am I too animated?
No.
Okay.
It happens to everybody. It's
All
just,
right.
you don't have a collar on your shirt, and
Okay.
that's what really
All
causes
right.
the problem. So you're good though. Okay, right back up.
All right, so as time went on, I think the first guy to copy them and make them, which was fine, was Ed Iskandarian. You know of them? Okay. And they made pulleys and so forth. I think they were casted, not out of billet, because it was cheaper. So that pretty much was that milestone, and that was, I'm guessing, around 56. That's, you know, it's been a long time.
But you were ahead on the billet because everything was needed to be lighter and lighter as time, so the aluminum was but it was cheaper for the cast.
Oh, by
Lighter
far.
for the billet.
Yeah, because, you know, Iskandarian was looking at it from a manufacturing cost standpoint and selling a lot of them. The thing is, some of these things that were innovated and created and so forth and so on, you have to realize, went from like 1956 through 72. That's a long time. It's not like I went bing, 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 like so. So the next thing that came along was, the exhaust rocker arms. In about 1963, at that time, I started building some engines. I had a little parts store in Philly, and I started to evolve the machine shop. I started with some valve grinding equipment, bought a boring bar, then a hone for the connecting rods and the piston bores, and, you know, it started going. So I was building some engines for some local drag guys up there. Nocentino had a dragster, Al Zerniak had a dragster, Tom Heffron, some other names of that time and so forth. So I would do work for them. Well, anyway, they were all running flat tappet cams. In fact, they were Isky cams that they were using at the time. And what started to evolve was the roller cams, because they could stand more lift and duration, et cetera, et cetera. So there were some like Crowler and Isky and some others were making roller cams. So we heard at the time it was week to week, whatever the hot setup was, which was the phrase that they used at that time, to try and gain an advantage on your competition. So we had heard that this Crowler 100R was the good cam. So we bought the kit, the springs and retainers and the whole deal, rollers and the cam and so forth. So we put it in, we go down the Atco dragway to run the car. It was in Al Zerniak's car. And the first thing that started to happen was the push rods were bending. So they were 3/8 push rods. We went to a Donovan 7/16 push rod, heavier push rod, nice. I think the Greek and some others were running them. So put those in, went back out, it broke the buttons. In the roller, there's a button that seats where the base of the push rod goes. Broke those. Go to the machine shop. This guy Ernie had a little shop. He makes up thicker, heavy-duty buttons. We get them heat-treated, put the buttons in. Put the buttons in, we go out and run the car. It starts breaking the exhaust rocker arms. No problem with the intakes. Well, there was a guy that hung out at this Al Zerniak shop that worked at a place called Dodge Steel, huge company up there. So he takes a sample of the rocker, forges the rocker arms, gives us a set of rocker arms. I take the rocker arms. It was like 3 or 4 thousandths on the bore. I had the sun and hone, so I honed the bore of the rocker arms, and on the end where it sits on the valve that needs a little radius, the quick way valve machine would do that with the rockers. Did that, so forth. Put the rockers arm on, went down to Atco, bingo. No problem. No problem. No problem. So there's a big event coming up at West Salem, Ohio. Garlic, snake, goose, all going to be there. We decide we're going to go. So we go out to West Salem, and the guys are running up and down, running some pretty good times. In fact, Garlic, as I recall, had low ET with about a 823, probably accurate. And but you could hear the cars when the RPM, they smoked the tires at that time. When the RPMs would get high and they would go through the lights, you could hear the engine flutter, like so, which meant they caught a rocker or two. And they'd go back, change it. Well, you know how observant Garwitz is. He don't miss anything. He comes over, we got the valve covers off, I'm adjusting the valves and so forth. And he says, I noticed you've been making runs, but not as quick as him. And you haven't been breaking any rockers. I said, no. I said, I had this set made. I had known him before then. In fact, before him, I met Art Malone that drove his car after he got burned in South Carolina. So I met Art first before I knew Garwitz. But anyway, the bottom line on that camshaft deal, yeah, it cured all that, but we still would burn exhaust valves and kill the valve springs. So we decided to try a cam that came out that Chrisman and Cannon was running. It was called a Herbert 70. And you use these Harman Collins rollers. It was these brass inserts with the roller really light that went up into a slot in the middle. So I called Chet Herbert, sent me a cam and the Harman Collins roller setup and so forth. We put it in the engine, bing, bom, no problem, no valve float, no problems with the springs, and didn't burn the exhaust valves, and it ran faster and ran quicker. So that was the evolution of the exhaust rockers. And as time went on, Donovan, I don't know who else made them, but Donovan made a really, really nice set of exhaust rockers. Plus he made aluminum stands with little roller inserts and shit. It was beautiful. Did a nice job. He made some nice stuff, Donovan. So that was the exhaust rockers. Following that, the Teflon rotors came to be. How they came to be was I had a shop called Dynamic Engines, which Garwitz worked out of in the summer because he would come up on tour because there was more money up east and all these tracks were close. So he worked out of my shop and stayed with a guy by the name of Joe Nocentino that also had a dragster. Him and Pat and the kids and so forth in the summer. But he would come over and work out of the shop. So anyway, at the time we were running a combination that was high compression, low blower speed, 10% overdrive. No problem with the blower rotors whatsoever. But the downside of the high compression at that time was it was hard on the upper shells of the rod bearings. It would smush them. So he decided to go to a lower compression and higher blower speed. So did that. I think they were like 250 down in the hole, the pistons, and we jacked the blower up to 30% overdrive. Well, I ran into a problem. The rotors, rotor to rotor, started to scuff and gall bad. I mean, you'd have to end up chucking the whole blower because of the speed. So I started thinking about it. In fact, the idea came to me one morning. I was making some eggs. And I was using it was brand new at the time pretty much, a Teflon coated frying pan. So they were doing this in a company, I forget the name of the company, it was North Jersey near Princeton. So I took a set of brand new rotors, took the rotors up there, and they coated them just like a frying pan. Put the rotors in, I did maybe 4 or 5 sets. They worked out well, no problem. Garlitz was about number 6. So we set him up a blower. He put the blower on the car. Well, the thing, because of the tolerances, would close up with his Teflon coating, would produce more air out of the blower at the same speed. Well, he had a match race with a guy by the name of Ron Goodsell. And it was at night at Cecil County. Traction there was phenomenal. So he had this match race, and he put the blower on with the Teflon rotors. And both left the line. They get about 3/4 mark down. You could see the smoke coming out of the pipes, the exhaust pipes from Gar's car. And the next thing, he burned the pistons because he didn't change the jet or anything, just ran the same, I think. He couldn't see. Oil in the face, front engine car, at night, poorly lit track. He ends up running into the rear of Ron Goodsell's car in their lane because he couldn't see. And the ironic part of that was after that, Goodsell put a sign on the back near the push bar that said Garlitz was here. Loved it. So anyway, the downside, what started to happen, which puzzled me at the time, some of the rotors that we were having done, when they would run the car, in fact, one of them was a good pair of racers from Dallas, Texas, called the Carroll Brothers. They run hard. Well, they got a set, and Murray Oxman and some other guys down there bought sets. They'd send the rotors up, I had them done. Well, Bones calls me, and they said, you've got a problem with the Teflon coming off of the rotor where they come together. And so I said, I haven't had any problem like that. I don't know what's going on. Well, anyway, bottom line, he sends them up, go back up to New Jersey, and the engineers start checking it. Well, apparently, if those rotors had any, they were very porous aluminum cast. If they had any impregnation of oil, okay, it wouldn't adhere properly. So I started thinking, well, everybody can't buy a brand new set of rotors. You know, in fact, most of the rotors were coming, were taken out. You know, they disassembled the blowers, shipped the rotors, because they've been running them. Well, when guys burn pistons and so forth, the oil comes up, it's on the rotors, you can't stop it. So I said, you know, this isn't going to work. So anyway, I started thinking, bottom line, ended up putting the Teflon strips on the rotors. But I used round strips because that was the stock that I could buy in a spool, this round stock. So that's what I used. And it worked well, was fine, no problems with it. And later on, Iskey and I think some others and so forth that were building blowers at the time, I forget this one guy's name, California. Anyway, it doesn't. Larry Bowers, I think his name was, that was doing blowers. Well, they started using Dovetail. I don't know where they got that stock or anything. But I guess they still use Dovetail today. I don't know. So that's how that evolved. The next thing, the starters. I had this shop called Dynamic Engines in Palmyra, New Jersey. Had every piece of equipment imaginable because my goal was to have one stop in-house. Had a crank welder, crank grinder, everything to do with crankshaft, heads, balancing, blockmaster, line bore, a Tobin Arp rod machine, you name it, to do everything. Well, what we would do, we put the engines in and so forth and so on. We'd take the car out on the street and push it down, fire the car up, adjust the barrel valve, and check with your hands what we used to do with make sure everything's firing, et cetera, et cetera. You set the barrel valve on it. Well, one night we got stopped by the cops. They said, Ends right here. No more. Deal's done. Okay, you can't do this anymore. Well, as you know, when the car's complete and so forth, you got to set things and check things out and so forth. You can't go to the track cold. So, anyway, a friend of mine used to build Indy cars in Ambler, PA. His name was Ken Hickey. Extremely talented guy, especially with body work. And at that time, they ran Alfenhausers and so forth. So, anyway, I was up there one day, and they backed the car out. It was a weekend on a Saturday. They backed the car out. Now you got this little thing on wheels, and they shoved the starter up to the back, fire the car up, do all their settings and so forth and so on. And I said, why can't I do that? Don't have to deal with the police. I can get everything set, check for leaks, and so forth and so on. He sells me a starter. I don't know, it's $200-300, whatever it was. I don't remember. So I take it back, make a nose bracket for the crankshaft, a torque pad to go over, because naturally when it goes one way, the torque is going another way, for the top of the frame, front engine car, and so forth. Well, because of the engine angle, you couldn't get the starter on, so I made this little stand-up piece of tubing with two little wheels, shove under the front axle, pick it up about a foot, so we could put the starter on. I did it on this guy's car that I was building engines for at the time. His name was Tom Heffron. They had a accounting business. His car was up there, tried it out. It worked sort of good. Was able to start the car. You had to prime it with gas. It wouldn't start on nitro. But the starter was straining. And I didn't like it. And we went down to a Quasco dragway, and it was cold. And this thing's turning over slowly, and it really didn't want to start. It finally kicked and started. But when they're cold natured, they don't like the cold. So I get back home, and I start thinking about it, and I'm standing there staring at it, and staring at the front, and staring at it, and all of a sudden I said, gee, I wonder if I put it up top, it'll help the strain, because we got a 30% underdrive, sort of like a flywheel in a little starter. But I wonder if the bell will take it. Because here I'm driving this thing with same deal. Try it. Make a stand and all for the top. There used to be a guy who had a little tiny machine shop over in Philly, which Garlitz had work done at. This old German guy by the name of Mr. Schmidt. Well, he would do all our little brackets and chingadera work and so forth and so on. Did a lot for Garlitz. So, anyway, made the brackets up and so forth and so on. Started it. It was fine. Worked great. Problem was, the racers would see me starting the car up, because at that time you couldn't use it at the track, just for starting it, setting the barrel valve, checking for leaks and pipes and so forth and so on, because everything was push start. So, I made up a kit for $750 with the brackets and so forth and so on. Guys wouldn't buy it, too much money. That was a lot of money in them days. So I started to think, well, if I sell it to the tracks, and they have two stands with a starter up at the line on each side, that way the guys only have to buy the bracket. They can pull the cars up, take the starters, bing, start them up, speed the show up. I know they're going to buy it. They were not interested in it in the least. I went to, and there was a lot of tracks up there. Went to every single track owner. No, I don't like it. They like pushing down in front of the stands, and the people like that. And I says, but they don't like it the show being slow. They want it quick. Couldn't sell it. So I just used it for personal use. However, it did evolve a few years later because of funny cars. It couldn't push. So the funny cars. A guy came east, him and his friend, it was named Jungle Jim Lieberman. And what was his buddy's name? God, I can't think offhand. He had his buddy had can't come to me. It'll come to me. Drives me nuts. Anyway, him and his friend came with funny cars, did the starters and so forth. Ray Arrington, his name was. And I used to do like line bores and bore their blocks and so forth. Jungle at first had a rat motor, a Chevy rat motor. But they couldn't put but 25% in it. If they put more in it, it would blow up. I think Arrington had a Chrysler, but I don't remember. Anyway, eventually Jungle went to a Chrysler. You didn't have a choice if you wanted to compete. So that was pretty much the starter deal, and then it evolved, funny cars, and then the dragsters started using it, and so forth and so on.
So how'd you get the name Trick?
By doing all these things.
It's Trick?
Yeah, there was I think it started this guy, I forget his name.
Who named you Trick?
Well, I don't recall his name at the time. He had a machine shop and did some engine work for a lot of guys in Virginia and Maryland and down in that area. Dickie something, I don't remember. But he gave me that title and it stuck pretty much. But that's how it evolved, doing these different things. And I got a couple more to do.
You'll have to say Tricky because you didn't use Tricky. So that's how you got the Tricky name, this guy.
He called me Tricks.
Tricks.
Yeah, because he knew there was always something coming.
You were actually MacGyver before MacGyver.
Oh, okay. Yeah, exactly.
Tricks MacGyver from Philly.
Didn't know who he was. But anyway, that's how I got that handle, because he knew that there was always something coming next. And after that, I developed interesting story to this. Because I was always thinking.
Right.
So I in Palmyra, where I had my shop, there was a concrete company that had a load of these Mack trucks. And they had air starters on them. And you could hear them things just whistling when they would go to start. Woo! Like so, and they'd start up. And I went over there and I said, God, wouldn't that be neat on a dragster? Or a funny car? Or whatever at the time. Just a dragster, I think. So anyway, I called Ingersoll Rand and talked to a guy about buying a starter. And I was telling him what I was going to try and do with it. So he says, that really sounds neat. He says, I'm going to send somebody over there. So a few days later, a week later, I don't remember how much time passed, this guy walks in with his big, beautiful yellow air starter, Ingersoll Rand. And he says, I'll make you a deal. He said, if you will let us use what you're doing in our monthly magazine, I'll give you the starter. I said, you got it. So I took the starter, got a big regulator, used a big nitrogen bottle because oxygen blow up. Got the biggest bottle from Welding Supply, hooked up a hose and so forth, did the brackets, put it on the front of the blower, barely would turn it. And I could tell it was straining, it was just gulping for air. I had a 1/2-inch Gates hose on it. So I put a 1-inch Gates hose on it with a hole about so big. Had like a 600-pound regulator. But the nice thing about it is when you would adjust the regulator, you could control the speed. Electric, it's all the same. So if you want to kick it up, where when it's cold out, you kick up the speed by adjusting the regulator up. Well, it worked fantastic. That was the upside. The downside, it used so much volume you would only get 3 or 4 starts out of a bottle, and you were through. That was the downside of it. But anyway, I did a couple of them, and I got a call from Pete Robinson. You remember a name called Sneaky Pete Robinson? Very innovative guy. He calls me, lightweight car, so he calls me on the phone. He says, I want to buy a kit. I said, I don't make them. I said, because I'm discovering it's not practical. I only get 3 or 4 starts out of a bottle. If you go and buy the air starter and so forth, it's expensive. And he says, well, I want to get it. I said, well, I don't have any to sell you, but I'll tell you how to do it. And what model air starter to use, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So, I tell him. Well, I don't remember how much time went by. He never had seen me. Well, we went to Bristol, Tennessee. I think it was for the summer or spring nationals, whatever they called it at the time. This was, I guess, 66 or 5 or 7 in there. So I look over, and in the pits, you know, all the racers, Gar's there, and Snake, and Goose, and everybody, and so forth. And Sneaky Pete. And on the back of his truck, he's sitting on the back of his truck, is a couple bottles, and the air starter. And I said, God, how neat. Well, I walk over, and as you know, especially, and even at that time, Bristol draws big time. There's a crowd around the back of the car, and he's doing autographs and so forth. I'm standing there waiting. Well, this one guy asked him about it, and he starts telling this guy how he created this starter system. And I'm getting hotter by the minute. So I wait till the crowd thins out, and I just simply walk up to him, and I reach my hand out, and I shake his hand. I said, by the way, my name's Walt Barbin, and walked away. Couldn't tell you whether his face turned red or whatever. But I never had a problem, because I knew as time went on and things would evolve, because I didn't have an interest in marketing stuff and so forth, that somebody would copy it, knock it off, sell it. It was fine, like Iski and so forth. But what I have a problem with is somebody else taking credit for what I've done, even though I've never really financially gained from it, which is okay. But don't take credit for, you know, it's like somebody saying I did the light bulb and it was Edison. You just don't do that. But it's done. That's society, I guess. Anyway, there was two more things, and I'll sew it up. At the time, let me try and frame a date here. It was about 1968. We were still running pretty high compression because it made power. I think Gar was always a fan of high compression. And the fuel pumps that we got from Hilborn at the time and Enderley, they were similar in size, but the castings just were different. But the internal gears were about the same, and the same volume. And we were running about 70 to 75% nitro with a blank jet. That's all you could get in it. And the 392s at the time were easy to read. You'd pull the plugs out and you'd read the plugs. 3 threads of heat was max. You go over that and you're burning pistons. So that's how we would read a plug at that time. So, knew that to try and get more volume of fuel in, it would get, and percentage, you'd have more power. Had no way of doing it. So, at the time, Hilborn made an adapter that went under a Vertex mag in the back of a 392 that had an offset drive for a fuel pump. So I started thinking, I'm going to run 2 fuel pumps and tee them into one line and feed the injector. So while I'm standing there, you know, because you have to start thinking where you're going to run lines, do brackets, this and that, and I'm staring at the front, and I said, God, if you can get more air in the engine by turning the blower faster, why not turn the pump faster? So I started thinking, I think I want to try that first. So just to be sure, at the time, I called this guy, Kent Enderley, Enderley Fuel Injection. And I talked to him about it, and he says, it's not going to work. He says, if you speed that up like that, it'll boil the fuel. He says, you're wasting your time. So I go back to my original same mindset. I'm going to do it. If it's no good, I'm throwing it out. I'm back where I started. So I went to Boston Gear. They had more gear sets and stuff than anybody in the world, I think, at the time. Bought a set of gears, little gears, and it was 15% difference between the original drive, which would make it 15% overdrive. I think I had Mr. Schmidt make the aluminum blocks and so forth, cut off an Allen wrench for the drive. So I put it on the engine. I think it was Cooper's car, but I'm not sure. It was either that or K&G Speed Shop. Went up, we had a race at Englishtown. It was a special event race where the dragsters would run the funny cars, giving the funny cars a 2/10 start. Jungle was there, and Arrington, and all those guys, and Snake, and Beebe and Mulligan. Remember them? I don't think Arliss was there, but anyway, we went there for a match race, and I had this thing on. Well, to try and keep it under wraps, Snake was there. I took a shop towel and tied a shop towel around it and ran some tape around it. So, not even knowing what to expect. So we go out, I make a run down with like 75%, and it is so rich. It's shooting ducks, what we used to call shooting ducks. When the car would get down, especially towards the end of the track, it would go pop, 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 flowing so much fuel, and we collected on it. We called it shooting ducks. So I come back, and I look at it, and I said, my God, this thing is just dead rich. I put 85% in it, left the blank jet in it. Man, that car went out and hauled the mail. I mean, hauled the mail. Beat these funny car guys to a drum. Well, Snake comes over, because, they can see this thing. They were all going to the 426. And this was a 392, which the reason we went to the 26 is because everybody did everything that they could to the 92s and hit their limit. Well, I didn't know even myself, but when I did this, it opened a brand new ball game. So Snake comes over, and he is another one like Gar. He's extremely observant. And he starts looking down. He says, well, what is all that? I said, well, I got a little fuel leak, and so I got a rag on there. And he says, yeah, right. He knew something was going. So anyway, that's how, it revolutionized fuel. Because once that started, bigger pumps, 2 pumps, more of this, pull the valve. It just went through the roof. So the only thing after that I can recall is in 72, I think it was, 71, 72, I think it was 72. Yeah, Garwitz had the rear engine car. TC hauled it around, worked on it, and so forth. Well, he had a testicle problem that came up. It was bad. And he was hospitalized. And I had just sold a business in Houston, transmission business. Gar called me up, and he says, Walt, what are you doing? And I said, well, I just sold a business, so I'm sort of not doing anything. He said, well, Tommy can't finish these last few races. Would you come help me? And I said, sure. He says, I'm racing in Dallas over the weekend. Come up and meet me in Dallas. And he said, we'll race Dallas. You can haul the car to Fremont. We'll race there. Haul it to Bristol, Tennessee. We'll race there, and then you can go home. I said, you got a deal. So, go up. We do the three races and so forth. And at the time, I think he was running what they call the Mammoth motor. The standard motor from Black was a 400 thousandths stroke. Elephant, they call it, elephant motor. So they went to a half-inch stroke. They call it a Mammoth. Half-inch killer. Garwitz, I'm pretty sure, had a 500-inch. Well, we were running 671s. Well, what was happening with this Mammoth motor, it wouldn't, no matter how fast you turned the blower, it wouldn't feed enough air. The thing kept saying, I want more air, I want more air. So after I got back home, I started thinking about it, and I went to a company in Houston that is just enormous. It's a Detroit diesel facility called Stewart and Stevenson. They make all kind of stuff for the military and all, huge company. So I went into parts, and we're rooting through the shelves and pulling boxes of blowers out because they had 671s, 871s. There was no such thing as a 10, 12, or 14 because Ken Veeney after that started to put them together and weld them and make them longer and so forth. But anyway, before that happened, so this guy pulls out this gigantic thing. It's like this huge, this big, heavy thing, about like so. He says, well, this is for our 1271 or whatever. It puts out all this air. And I said, God, that'll do it. So anyway, I go back home. I didn't buy it or anything. And I started thinking about it. I said, yeah, this is going to be good. So at the time, unfortunately, sometimes I'm a little too trusting. There was a guy by the name of Mark Danicus who was making blowers, casting cases and so forth. So, great big heavy guy. Knew him well. And I called him. I said, I think this thing's going to work. I said, and we talked blowers back and forth and so forth because that was his game. And I said, yeah, I think I'm gonna do this. Get castings and all made up for the case and so forth. Sure enough, like 2 months later, whatever it was, he's got one at Gainesville, which was fine. That's pretty much it. That's pretty much it.
So how do you want to be remembered?
Somebody loved the sport.
I'd like to start off by, I'd like to be remembered by.
I'd like to be remembered by the contributions that I made, which are all still being used today. And, for Garwitz got on me about it because I'm not a person that's a camera person or that likes to toot their own horn and all that. And over the last year or so, and I communicate with him a couple times a week, email, phone calls, and so forth. And I started thinking about it, and I said, you can't hide from the truth. And it needs to be told, and whoever wants to accept it can accept it, and whoever doesn't, that's fine. And that's what I'd like to be remembered for, period.
Good deal.